Good morning, everyone. I'm David with the Vallombrosa Online Retreat Center, and we're broadcasting live from our digital retreat center. And we're very happy to welcome Alice Camille. Alice will be running a retreat for us very shortly on May 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, called Stories That Could Be True. And she's going to give you a little bit of an introduction to that. So that's not this weekend, but the following. This Friday, we'll have an online art therapy class on drawing your own mandala that will help people through their kind of, I guess, COVID emotional recovery. So Alice has been with us a few times, so I'd like to share with you a little bit about her. She is a nationally known writer, a religious educator, and retreat leader. Alice has received her Master's of Divinity degree from the Franciscan School of Theology in Berkeley. She's the author of 20 books, including For Everything There Is a Season and This Transforming Word. Her writing has earned numerous awards from the Catholic Press Association and the Associated Church Press and the Interfaith Religion Communicators Council. Alice writes this monthly scripture commentary, exploring the Sunday readings, and collaborates on the homily service, Prepare the Word. She is a regular Testaments columnist for U.S. Catholic Magazine. She also contributes regularly to Take 5 for Faith, Living with Christ, Give Us This Day, and the newsletter Discernment Matters. Alice has an online column, Questions Catholics Ask, at Vision and Vocation Network. Alice currently works as a full-time freelance writer and speaker from her home in Rhode Island. Apart from her degree at the GTU in Berkeley, she lived in California, in the Bay Area, also in the Sierras in the town of Bishop, and finally in Desert Hot Springs for a total of 25 years. She's appeared as a retreat leader twice before at Vallombrosa, and as a lifelong Catholic lay minister, Alice takes the God business seriously and religion with a sense of humor. So, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, Alice Camille.
Thank you, David. Are we on?
We are on.
Okay. Well, it's good to be digitally at Vallombrosa, though I wish I could be physically there this time. But let's keep all our hopes pinned on that day when we can gather together safely and explore the values and the stories that are closest to our hearts. Stories and storytelling is basically the meat of my life. I have been involved with stories since I was 5 years old and I learned how to read. I remember my older sister taking me to the library for the first time and getting me my own library card. And I looked at all of those books on the shelves and I thought to myself, it's going to take me my whole life to read all of these books. Basically, reading, being a reader, became my central identity, my sense of myself, probably until I was 9. And that's when I switched allegiances and decided what I really wanted to be was a writer of books. Books remained at the center of my universe, but my relationship to them was more as a contributor to those libraries. It wasn't until I was in high school that I started to think a little more broadly. By then, the God questions had become more real for me, and I was really beginning to feel a sense of what we call, for lack of a better word, vocation. The sense that life had some kind of meaning and purpose and destiny, and I wanted to explore what that was. So at that point, I began to pay more attention in church, which is something I hope all of you are doing too, and that you too are feeling a sense of purpose and destiny about every day of your life. So I started paying more attention to church, and what I discovered was that the first half of the Mass is basically storytelling. I mean, the liturgy of the word is when we read books aloud to each other. We tell stories to each other. And so I got really involved in that. And I began to realize that all of my personal identities were coming together. I mean, first as a reader, and then as a writer, and finally as a person with purpose and destiny to my life. I began at that point to prepare professionally to become one of the sacred storytellers myself. And the larger truth we learn when we start paying attention in church is that these stories, these sacred stories, are everywhere. You know, what's true in Bible stories is also true in human history. And it's also true in your personal history and mine. You know, these are stories that could be true. And whether or not they become true has a lot to do with the decisions that we both make. So I've had this lifelong love affair with books and stories and words and ideas. And I've also been smitten by the God quest. You know, I've had this sense that I want to cast myself onto the great mystery, and I want to be reinvented as a kinder, gentler, better, more loving version of myself. That's still my hope. And this led me to enroll first as an English major in college, and then as a student of theology in graduate school. And all of this has basically led to the retreat that I'm going to be offering on the weekend of May 22nd to the 24th at Vallombrosa. It's entitled Stories That Could Be True, but I didn't make that up. That's actually the title of a book by William Stafford, who is a poet. And I first started reading Stafford when I was at another library. I was at Cal Library wandering through the stacks one day in Berkeley, and I saw the spine of a book as I was going by, and I was intrigued by the title. It said Stories That Could Be True. And I thought, stories that could be true. It was the conditional tense of this title that intrigued me, because these stories weren't boasting that they were true. They simply could be true. They might be true under the right circumstances. So I was intrigued, and I checked the book out. And that was in the 1980s. 40 years later, I'm still reading Stafford, and I'm still wondering about that title. You know, I'm wondering why some stories become true and others don't. You know, it's sort of like this pandemic that we find ourselves in the midst of. Why did this story become our national story and, in fact, our global story, and not some other happier saga this spring? And more importantly, perhaps to ask, is this: of the quantum number of scenarios that might emerge from this pandemic, which one will become the path that the world chooses to take from here? Now, obviously, in many ways, this is a global choice. This is a national choice that we're all facing. For Californians, as for Rhode Islanders like me and everybody else, it's a local communal choice that we're all making together. But that doesn't detract from it also being an immediate and a personal choice that each of us is invested in every hour. Because while we're all definitely living a story that is true for us right now, we also face a multitude of futures that could be true from here on in. What happens next is literally in your hands and mine. Now, I'm sure you've seen the statistics about the contagion rate for this virus. For every one person that gets COVID-19, 2 people are likely to become infected on average. That's a lot of contagion, and that's why this thing is spreading so fast. But while I was contemplating this statistic, other ideas were floating around in my inbox. Because from the very first days that when a national emergency was declared over this virus, people started sending me things, unbidden things, admittedly. A friend of mine, for example, wrote a song on his guitar, and he recorded it and sent it to me. It was lovely. Several friends wrote essays, manifestos really, about what they were experiencing and feeling about all of this. And 2 of my friends wrote 2 whole books and sent the manuscripts along to me. I mean, this is what happens when most of your friends are writers. You know, they're all under stay-at-home orders, and they clearly have too much time on their hands, which results in more books in the world. But what I was getting most frequently from people, along with the same YouTubes that I'm sure you've seen, and the photos of people's garden flowers as they came up one by one, what I was getting most from people were poems. The strangest people started sending me poems, even writing their own poems and sending them along. And I hate to admit it, but even I wrote a poem during Holy Week, and I haven't written a poem in 30 years. Like many of you, I have an extended family that's not located in one single city. My siblings and their kids are all over the United States. So the day when the pandemic emergency, national state of emergency was declared in this country, we set up a gang email so that we could all stay in touch. And on day 14 on our family thread, my 10-year-old grandniece, Emma, wrote her first poem. It went like this: roses are red, violets are blue. Coronavirus is making everybody go cuckoo. Now, the form of her poem was a single line, and clearly the meter was a little off. And yet, as first poems go, it wasn't bad. And it was actually quite expressive of the zeitgeist. Since that attempt, however, Emma has written a poem every day, 50 poems so far. And my favorite one of her poems came the day that I had given Emma, well, perhaps too much writerly advice about how a poem should go. Now, I had also been complaining in this particular email to the family about people sending me their books during lockdown and asking me to endorse them, as if I had time to be reading everybody else's books. I noted, in fact, that if one more person suffering from stay-at-home syndrome asked me to read their unpublished manuscript, I was going to leap out the window of my second-floor apartment. Well, 10-year-old Emma's reply that night on the family thread arrived, not surprisingly, in verse. And it read, Mom and Dad are letting us be lazy, but Aunt Alice is driving me crazy. This poem is my crowning glory. Please, don't jump off the second story. Now, what Emma's poems have made me realize over these nights, and the last one just came last night, in fact, what these poems are making me realize is that the epidemic rate that we're facing is merely 1 to 2. One person infects 2. But you and I affect a lot more than just 2 people every day with every decision that we're making. And I don't just mean wearing gloves, washing our hands, wearing a mask, as important as those things are. What I've learned from 10-year-old Emma's choice to make poetry out of this disastrous health crisis, I've learned that that's an inspired choice. All of my friends who are writing songs and manifestos are trying to make something creative about their lockdown experiences, and that's an inspired choice too. You and I can use this time any way we want. We can strengthen and purify and pray and become wise, or we can just eat a lot of chips and binge watch a lot of shows. And believe me, I am a fan of chips and shows. I'm logging quite a lot of couch time myself these days. But I'm also learning some things about my limits, like where to draw the line between the need to accomplish and the need to play. I'm finding out when it's good to pray and when it's better to get some exercise, when it's time to eat something or maybe just time to take a nap, when it's time to make a phone call to somebody that I really love just because I need to hear a friendly voice. And I'm also learning that all the stuff that I really don't value under normal circumstances, that's actually very valuable stuff, precious stuff. All the wasteful, inefficient connections that we used to make with each other all the time, actually, they count for a great deal. Now, being over 60 myself, back in March, I was doing my best to stay at home. In fact, I still stay at home as much as possible. But as a freelancer, I get paid piecemeal. You know, I get a lot of tiny little checks that come to me now and again instead of one grand payday once in a while. And I'm fully aware, of course, that it's a privilege that all those little checks still come to me when so many people aren't receiving any checks at all. But there came a day back in March when I needed to get some of these tiny little checks to the bank in order to pay some of my bills. So when I got to the local branch, there was a problematic individual. So I waited and I waited, but this guy seemed parked there for the whole morning. And finally, I lost patience and I went inside the bank. When was the last time you went inside a bank? I went up to the teller's window, a thing I haven't done for probably a decade. There was no one in the bank at all except for the 3 women behind the plexiglass wall at the service windows. And the teller I approached had to give me instructions on how to do this transaction. It had been so long, things had changed so much, and I had forgotten how it goes. But it was also hard to hear this woman behind the plexiglass and the mask. So finally she apologized that all of this was so difficult, that in fact everything is so difficult these days. And then this woman looked at me very meaningfully, and she said, behind the mask and behind the wall of plastic, "I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." And these words had a very powerful effect on me. They seemed to come crashing through layers of cloth, mine and hers, and the wall of plastic, and the frustrating business transaction that we were involved in, and through all the anxiety that we are all carrying around these days. These simple antique words of greeting, well, they made me shiver. Tears came to my eyes, and I replied to this stranger, "It's good to meet you. I hope your family is well." And then tears came to her eyes, and she nodded, "We're all well so far." And all of a sudden, I realized there was nothing between us at all. We were just two women caught in the eye of a global storm, trying our best to cope and to keep calm amid a sea of uncertainty. We finished our transaction, but I stayed a moment longer just to say, "God bless you and your family." And then I left. Back on the sidewalk, I felt a sense of wonder about this encounter. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have never blessed a teller before. And I couldn't have imagined before that day hearing a teller say to me that she was pleased to make my acquaintance. It was an enormously humanizing exchange. And even though I've spent most of my life getting in and out of such exchanges as expediently as possible, seeing them as in the way of getting through my workday, always preferring time over people, that encounter back in March has marked me, and it's changed me. And ever since then, I have made it my intention to choose people over time, to choose people over tasks, even to choose people over accomplishment, over whatever else seems most urgent to me at the time. Now, I can't say if that woman's world was similarly affected, if perhaps her day was rescued by what passed between us. But I do know that that encounter with her was a kind of rescue for me. And it's made me consider that God didn't find saving a world a waste of celestial time and purpose. God thinks that you and I are actually worth stopping eternity for. God thinks you and I are worth entering history for, even dying for. And if this is the story that God chooses, if this is what God calls a sacred story, well, then you and I can only be grateful to be part of it. Which is why the weekend of May 22nd through the 24th, I'm offering a series of 5 reflections through Vallombrosa Center on gratitude and poetry and solitude and mysticism and grace. And if you can make room in your life for these reflections, if you would like to participate in some stories that could be true and take a little journey down the path that we might choose, well then, all I can say is, I'd be pleased to make your acquaintance.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was a beautiful reflection. And I think that if everyone who's listening would like to sign up, please visit vallombrosa.org/calendar and scroll down to the weekend of May 22nd. You can sign up for Alice's upcoming retreat of stories that could be true. And it's going to be a fascinating trip with a lot of different choices that we can make about how we interact with one another and ourselves. So thank you so much, Alice.
Thanks, David. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Take care. Bye.